Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you on this beautiful afternoon. Before we start, I will be announcing the first speaker, and after that, they will just please follow your program, and they will come up automatically and speak. I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to the celebration of the 175th anniversary of the Friedens Church, Die Gleich Kadik mit ein Groß Herz. We are appreciative and we are thankful, and we remember our ancestors who had strong faith and courage to have you keep your church and brought forward by your descendants. Now our first speaker will be Jamie Harway. He will tell you about the history of the church.
Welcome to Friedens Church and their 175th anniversary. And I'm going to give you a little history about the start of the church and the township. Prior to 1848, the land that the Friedens Church and the cemetery is on was part of the farm of John and Catherine Peter, and this was Heidelberg Township in Lehigh County. So in 1847, and probably prior to 1847, there were discussions among the residents of Heidelberg Township and the Lehigh County Commissioners to divide the township into two separate townships. And by December 6th of 1847, it was confirmed and ordered that the township be divided into two separate townships. The western portion retained the name of Heidelberg Township, and the eastern portion became known as Dallas Township. And Dallas Township also included, which is present-day Slatington. Slatington wasn't incorporated until 1864. So I didn't find anywhere why they named it Dallas Township, but George Dallas was the Vice President of the United States back in 1847. And he was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was the vice president under James Polk. So it was probably named after him. And on March 17th of 1848, the first officers were elected for Dallas Township. But apparently, the residents weren't too happy with the name Dallas Township, because by April 21st of 1848, by act of assembly, they renamed the township to Washington Township. And there's still some evidence of Dallas Township. One of our first Reformed ministers was Joseph Dubbs, and on his marriage records, which they have down at Lehigh County, the library at Lehigh County Historical Society, it shows some of the residents that he married were from Dallas Township. So, with the new township being separated from Heidelberg Township, the residents realized the new township was going to be without a house of worship. So they decided they were going to build a church in Dallas Township. Most of the people that lived in this area either belonged to Neff's Union Church or Heidelberg Union Church. And Friedens became a Union church also. They had a Lutheran congregation and a German Reformed congregation. In the anniversary history of Lehigh County, which was published in 1914, it says about the year 1815, Dorsey Rudy held school in a log building where the Friedens Church now stands. So they probably decided on this area because there was already a public building on this property. And it also states that school was held in the church-owned building until 1881, when the present schoolhouse was built. And the present schoolhouse they're talking about was the Friedens School, which is 3 houses south of the church at the corner of Avery Road and Route 873. At some point, the log building that they used for school on this property was replaced with a stone structure, and the stone building was in the south parking lot of the church here, which was right against Route 873. The Friedens book, which was written by Walter Hanwork in 1971, states that the church's caretaker home was built before the church, and it was used for school, for religious services, and they also used it to plan to build Friedens Church. So he also states that the first slate blackboard in the country was put into this school building in about the year 1850 and used by the teachers. The church house that we're talking about, it was used by the caretakers of the church, and it was tore down in the year 1986. So originally, the committee members to build the Friedens Church purchased 6.5 acres from John and Catherine Peter. The cost was $237.50, and it was recorded in Lehigh County Courthouse on May 31st, 1847. So John and Catherine Peter's farm was down next to the daycare in Friedens and across the street from the village C-store. The original farmhouse was a log home and it burned down, and then they built the existing structure, which is still standing next to the daycare. It's at 7047 Route 873. And the barn was across the street, and that burned down in April of 1964. But their farm went from the village C-store all the way up to the top of the hill where the PP&L substation is. So it was pretty much included the whole village of Friedens at the time. So they appointed a master foreman to build the church back in 1847, and the first person that they appointed was Jacob Coons, and he died before the church even got underway to being built. He died February 11th, 1847, and he's buried down at the Neff's Church. So they had to appoint another master foreman, which was Daniel Ritter, and they started the Friedens Church, and on May 9th, 1847, they dedicated the cornerstone, and the church was built by native fieldstone, and they got lumber from local sawmills to build the Friedens Church. So, Daniel Ritter died before the church was completed. He died on September 1st of 1847, and he was the first person buried on the Friedens Cemetery. And his funeral was under a large chestnut tree on the property here, because the church wasn't finished yet. Jeff has a picture of the cemetery here, so he's buried all the way up in this top northeast corner of the cemetery. And there's the church, on the original church records, they didn't really keep death records until 1857, so there's a lapse in time of the records kept for 10 years. But in September of 1964, Lehigh County, the Historical Society, they have a library down there, and they went around to all the local churches and got all the church records and recorded a lot of the cemetery records. So in 1964, Raymond Hollenbach came up from Royersford, Pennsylvania, and he recorded all the tombstones on the church cemetery. He didn't record the children's graves, but he recorded what he could on the adult graves, and he added a lot of information. Like if they were baptized at Heidelberg or Neff's Church, he added information into his book. And I have a copy of the information that he recorded, if anybody's interested in trying to find anybody buried in the older section of the cemetery. Most of the people buried in the Friedens Cemetery, their families were native to this area going way back into the 1700s. The most common surname you'll find on the cemetery is Kern. And Some of the other common names you'll see are Remeli, Andrews, Peters, Lentz, Zellners, and Reavers. Most of the older tombstones are inscribed in German. So, like the Andrews family, you also see spelled in German, which is spelled Andreas, Andries. And the Andrews family lived in this area way back into the 1700s. Andries up in Carbon County, the village is named after the family because a branch of the family moved up there. So, members of the Friedens Church were given a grave when they died, so they were buried, people were buried in the older part of the cemetery as they died. Like there were no family plots back then, so, and that was pretty common in the early church cemeteries. And there was a lot of children's graves, so there's a row of adult graves, and then there's children graves, and they all were buried in a row as they died. If you were a non-member of Friedens Church, they charged $5 fee to get buried in the cemetery, and they charged $2.50 for a child to get buried. And the only rule was they had to be friendly to the Reformed or Lutheran congregations. As time went on, the cemetery started selling family plots, so if you go south of where the older section is, you'll find family plots in the cemetery. So, there weren't a lot of restrictions to who can get buried in the cemetery. There was a man that lived in the village. He had his leg amputated and had it buried in the cemetery. There's a man who was convicted of murder, and he was tried and hung up in Carbon County, and he's buried in the cemetery. And we'll hear a little bit about him later on in the talk. The church ran the business of the cemetery up until about 1920, and that's when they formed a cemetery association, and then they established perpetual care to take care of the cemetery. The church also added a memorial garden in the early 2000s. I think the first burial, people can have their ashes buried in the memorial garden. The first burial was about 2012. A little bit of information about the older part of the cemetery. They're all the old white limestone tombstones, and a lot of them are inscribed in German. You'll find some of the stones have a square cut out of the middle of them, and they'll have a little hinged stone in front of them. Years ago, the families would put an old tin-type picture in there of the person that was deceased. And my aunt grew up next door to the cemetery. She told me back in the 1920s and 30s, you could still see some of those pictures in the tombstones. Another thing with the old cemetery, they didn't really have perpetual care back then, so the family of the people buried there had to either cut the grass, or you'll find ground cover over, and you'll see that ground cover in the spring because it flowers so that the grass wouldn't grow over the graves. And you also can see there's some limestone beds over the whole grave so that they wouldn't have to mow the grass there, but a lot of those have been removed because of cutting grass there. The other thing I wanted to talk about on the symbols on the old tombstones, you'll find a lot of different symbolism on the old stones, and they all have some type of meaning. Some of the ones that you'll find on this cemetery, you'll see an arch, which is symbolic of victory of life or death. You'll see birds in flight, which is a symbol for winged soul or eternal life. There'll be books on the tombstone, which is showing their faith or book of life, or it'll show a Bible and Bible verses on it. There's Civil War Union shields on some of the stones, people that were veterans of the Civil War. You'll see crosses in some of the tombstones. There's different kind of crosses. There's the Celtic cross, Greek cross or Latin cross. Some of the crosses I did see will have an IHS stamped on the front of it, and that stands for the first 3 letters of the name of Jesus, and that's in Greek. So that's what the IHS stands for Jesus in Greek. If you see drapery over anything on these tombstones, it stands for sorrow or mourning. Flags, usually they were members of the military, and there's fraternal organization symbols on a lot of the stones. You'll see a lamb on a lot of the children's tombstones, so that's usually a child's grave, which depicts purity and innocence. If you'll see flowers or plants on the stones, it's a sign of love or grief or happiness. There, you'll see roses on some of these tombstones, and that's symbolic of love, beauty, hope associated with the Virgin Mary. Scroll stands for life and time, honor or commemoration. You'll see shields, which stands for protection, faith, or defense of the spirit. You see tree trunks, trees and tree trunks. Tree depicts the all-covering love of Christ. If you see a cut tree stump, which we have out here too, it also symbolizes mortality, and it can mean life cut short or sudden death. You'll see willow trees on a lot of these old tombstones, which has several meanings. It could be mourning or weeping. It also can mean longevity, signs of immortality, or life after death, or resurrection of the soul. Urns on the stones will be Greek symbols of mourning, or wreaths or garlands can stand for victory, memory, or path to eternal life. There's a lot of symbols you'll see on these old tombstones. And again, a lot of them are in German. I have some translations of the German words on these stones if anybody's interested in looking at that, German to English translations. The last thing I'm going to talk about is some of the members of the original building committee. They're all buried here in the cemetery. There were 2 Reformed building committee members and 2 Lutheran committee members. The Reformed one was Jacob Remaley. He's buried in row 10. He was born in 1790 and died in 1865. He was the son of Ambrose and Elizabeth Remaley, and he was baptized down at Unionville Church, which is Neff's. And he was, in the history of Lehigh County, it states that he owned the upper part of Slating, which Slatington now is built upon. So he owned a farm in the southern portion of Slatington. And he was one of the first township supervisors of Washington Township. And his wife was Catherine Remaley. She's buried in row 4. She was born in 1794 and died in 1857. The other Reformed member of the building committee was John Fenstermaker. He was born in 1801 and died in 1875. He's buried in row 18, and he's buried with his wife, Susanna Fenstermaker. And she was the daughter of Daniel and Elizabeth Reber. The Rebers owned the farm just south of the Village C store on 873, which the Merkel family occupies right now. She was born in 1803 and died in 1873. And John Fenstermaker was also one of the first township supervisors of Washington Township, and he was also an auditor for Washington Township. The Lutheran members of the building committee for Friedens Church was Jacob Haler, and he was a tanner by trade. He lived up at Lehigh Gap. His house is still up there next to the Lehigh Gap Nature Center, and he had a tannery up there. He was elected one of Washington Township's first elected school directors. There were 4 school directors back then in 1847. And his wife was Sarah Haler. She was born in 1799 and died in 1897. They're buried together in row 13 of the old cemetery. And the other Lutheran committee member was Daniel Ritter, who was the first person buried in our cemetery. And he was born in 1802 and died in 1847. The other two people buried in, they were trustees on the deed for Friedens Church. There was a Lutheran and a Reformed trustee. And the Lutheran trustee was George Wassam. He's buried in row 1 of the cemetery. He was a carpenter, and he was born in 1798 and died in 1855. The Reformed trustee on the deed for Friedens Church was George Kern, the elder. He was born in 1774 and died in 1850. He was the grandson of Nicholas Kern, who was the founder of Lower Slatington. And his wife was Maria. Her maiden name was Sensinger, and she's buried in row 10 in the old part of the cemetery. And the last two people I wanted to talk about are John Peter and his wife Catherine. Her maiden name was Hawes. They're buried in the first row of the old cemetery. They were the ones that owned this property where the church is. John Peter was the son of John, and Elizabeth Blos was her maiden name, Peter, and he was baptized at Heidelberg Church. So a lot of these people belonged to either Heidelberg or Neff's church before Friedens Church was built. So that's all the history I have of the church so far, and Jeff's going to talk a little bit more about some of the Civil War veterans buried at Friedens Church.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie. There are 22 Civil War veterans that are buried here at Friedens Cemetery. Charles Fisher, Charles Venstermacher, David Smith, Frank Kunkel, Gabriel Kern, Gideon Lenz, Henry Kreitz, John Crosley, John Hankey, John Lenz, John Nonemaker, John Snyder, Jonathan Metzger, Louis Dybert, Paul Sauerwein, Samuel Kunkel, Tillman Frederick, Valentine Amend, William Roth, William Messimer, William Newhart, and William Smith. 4 of them died during the Civil War, and I will talk a little bit more about those 4. And they're all buried together, and they're all on the cemetery plot. They're in this area here are the 4 Civil War. Their graves are all lined up in one section. So the first one I'll talk about is John Lenz. I've seen it spelled also as Linz. And I have to give a thank you to Mike Hoffman, who helped me enormously with the genealogy, because these people died in general pretty young. That's soldiers usually die young. And those days there were no social media, there was very few records of their accomplishments or what they have done. So what I did is I looked up what they did during the war, and then Mike helped me with the genealogy on their family relationship. So John Lenz was born October 20th, 1840 in Heidelberg Township, because everything was Heidelberg Township at that time. Washington didn't exist yet. His parents were Conrad Jr. and Elizabeth. He must have been in August 15, 1862. He volunteered because the draft didn't exist until March 1863. So he served Company F of the 132nd Pennsylvania Infantry. That was organized in Harrisburg, August 1862. Started out in Washington, D.C. Until September 2nd. Then went to Maryland campaign, September 6th to the 22nd. He was in the Battle of Antietam in September 16 and 17. Then moved to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, September 22nd. Did duty there until October 30th. Then they did reconnaissance to Leesburg, October 1st and 2nd. Advanced up to the Loudoun Valley and moved to Falmouth, Virginia, October 30th till November 17th. And then he was in the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 12th to 15th. He was wounded in the Battle of Fredericksburg on the 13th of December. He was apparently a bullet hit his elbow and got stuck in his elbow. He ended up with what they call lockjaw, which is tetanus, which was very common in those days. If you got hurt, there were no antibiotics, no medicine to help you in those days. So lockjaw was a pretty terrible disease. The incubation period is around 20 days, 2 to 20 days, and the symptoms are severe muscle spasms. Starts usually in the face, that's why it was called lockjaw. But this muscle spasm could be so bad that sometimes people would even break bones because of the disease of the muscle spasm. And the survival rate was only 10%, so it was not a happy disease. That's where John Lenz died from lockjaw in a hospital in Washington. He was the youngest of the family. He had 5 sisters and a couple of brothers. So his sister was Abigail. She married David Kern. The sister Salome, who married Jeremiah Lee. The sister Janet, who was born in 1831 but died young. And a sister Elizabeth, who married Caspar Brensinger. And a sister Harriet, who married Jonas Hoffman. He had 3 brothers, Peter, Ephraim, and Gideon. Gideon was also in the Civil War, and he's buried here on the cemetery also. Gideon was a sergeant in the 176th Pennsylvania Regiment. And Gideon is also the great-grandfather of Dewey Lenz, and you will hear more about Dewey Lenz in one of the other presentations. So the next soldier I will talk about is William Roth. He was born November 8, 1845. His parents were Allen Roth and Harriet Ravert. He volunteered October 26, 1861 at the age of 15. In 1861, President Lincoln declared that the minimum age for enlistment had to be 18, although a lot of boys volunteered under the age of 18, and there was very little really checking done on that. So in the beginning they could volunteer with under 18 if they had permission of their parents, but that was later abolished. A year later Lincoln decided that you had to be 18, but even then a lot of youngsters volunteered and they said they were 18, and there was very little checks done on that. So they would serve. He served in Company I of the 67th Pennsylvania Infantry. The 67th was organized in Philadelphia in March 1862. So went to, in April 3rd, they left for Annapolis, Maryland. There they did guard duty and provost duty in Eastern Maryland and at Camp Parole in Annapolis. February 1863, they moved by rail to Harper's Ferry and then to Berryville, Virginia. And he died April 10th, 1863, at age 17 at a hospital in Berryville of typhoid fever. The regiment, the 67th Regiment, lost 2 officers and 77 enlisted men killed or mortally wounded, and 3 officers and 150 enlisted men by disease. So when I started looking at the history of the different regiments, but actually way more soldiers died of disease than they did of wounds that they encountered in battle. So the living conditions were certainly not very, very healthy. William had siblings, Sarah Elizabeth, who died very young, Benjamin W., who lived from 1850 to 1922, Elias Peter from 1853 to 1892, Katharina Louise, who was never married, Mary Jane Matilda, who died very young and is buried here at Friedens as well, Amanda Jane, who married John Bartholomew. His father worked in the slate quarry and in the different census, and his mother received the Civil War pension beginning 1887. The family lived in Slating at the corner of Church Street and Middle Alley, and there were some records that shows that his father, Allen, also served in the Civil War as a private in Company D of the 176th Pennsylvania, which was a drafted militia. So, and in the obituary of Allen Roth, his father, the father of William, it says that he died September 11, 1899 of consumption, which is tuberculosis, and his mother Harriet, died in 1908 from gangrene. So these are all diseases that we don't worry about nowadays, but it was different then. My next soldier is Gabriel Kern. He was born October 1st, 1833, and his parents were Jonas Kern and Elizabeth Snyder Kern. His father died when Gabriel was a teenager. He was a brickmaker, according to the 1860 census, and he lived in Slatington. His mother received the Civil War pension starting in 1879. He mustered in August 12, 1862, when he was 28. Served Company G of the 128th Infantry. Left Pennsylvania for Washington August 16th. Moved to Frederick, Maryland, September 6th to the 14th. Was in the Battle of Antietam. He was wounded, but he stayed with the regiment, so his wounds were probably not that severe. Then they moved to Sandy Hook and Maryland Heights, September 22nd to December 10th. Moved to Fairfax Station, Virginia. Then to Stafford Courthouse in January the 19th to the 23rd, and they stayed there until April 27th. He was in the Battle of Chancellorsville, and he was wounded there again. And the regiment was actually relieved from their duty. Their term was up. They moved back to Harrisburg and mustered out in May 19, 1863. But Gabriel died June 8, 1863 at a hospital in Harrisburg. So he, it's not very clear if he died as a result of the wounds of the Battle of Chancellorsville or if it was a disease. So his siblings were Maria. She was born 1824. Fayetta, 1828. We have no dates when they passed away. Lydia was from 1830 to 1846, and he had a brother Griffith who lived from 1835 to 1914, and a sister Amanda who died when she was a teenager. So that's for Gabriel Kern. And then I have Paul Sauerwein, was born December 8, 1844. His parents were Elias and Elizabeth. They were married in 1837. He mustered in March the 2nd, 1864, and served with Company D of the 51st Pennsylvania Infantry. The 51st was originally organized in Harrisburg in 1861, but they reorganized in 1864. So the regiment was actually on a veteran furlough from January through March. So Paul joined them during that veteran furlough. So then from Harrisburg they went to Annapolis, Maryland till April the 23rd. And then he was in the battle battles of the Wilderness, May 5th to 6th. That battle took place about 15 miles west of Fredericksburg. The fight was in an area of dense second-growth forest, locally known as the Wilderness, just to the west and sometimes overlapping the 1863 Battle of Chancellorsville, which was about a year earlier. The battle was a stalemate with heavy casualties on both sides, and it was estimated to be the third bloodiest battle of the Civil War. So this was a pretty serious battle he was in. He was wounded on May 6th, 1864 at Wilderness Corner, and he died May 22nd at age 19 from a disease in a hospital in Harrisburg. He only served 79 days, so he didn't last long in the war. His siblings were Alfred Lewis, who lived from 1838 to 1908. Mary Ann married William Baker, and he had a brother Henry, and a sister Catherine, who married John J. Williams. And that is all the information I have on these Civil War soldiers.
Talking about the murderer who is buried in this cemetery, and this information is all thanks to Jamie Harway, who did all the research, and I tried to do further research in newspapers.com, but could not find anything out. So it's a mystery. But Jamie just told me today that well, I didn't know how people were buried in the cemetery, because I only ever thought of family plots, which is how my family is buried in the various cemeteries. I did not know that they were buried as they died. But the interesting thing about Oliver William Stangley is that he's buried in the center of the cemetery, you said, with no one else around him. So I guess that was either planned or not planned, but anyway, from the Slatington News, from April 1st, 1891, Oliver William Stangley, the Slatington News reports his name as Stangley, yet his tombstone says Stengel, so we don't know which one it was. But he was executed at Mock Chunk on the famous gallows at 11:05 in the afternoon. It says death was almost instantaneous, and the neck was broken by the fall. And I don't know if you've seen on TV shows, especially Old West TV shows, whenever there was a hanging, it was kind of an affair. You took a picnic basket, you took the kids, you just did the whole thing. It was not looked at as, oh my God, this is the last thing in the world I want to look at. But it said that the doomed man showed great courage and walked boldly to the gallows and signified his willingness to die and spoke but a few words. The jail yard was crowded with spectators who behaved in an unseemly manner, and this is from the Slatington News. He was arrested for the murder of a Mrs. Walbert, who was supposedly a resident of the village of Friedens. The murder took place in Weatherly, so that's quite a distance from here. And I was really curious to find out if there was what the reason for. I mean, to murder someone, and it doesn't say how he murdered her, if it was a gunshot, or if he stabbed her or strangled her. But you would assume that there was. I look at it as it was probably a crime of passion. He was only 31 years, 5 months, and 24 days old when he died. So he was pretty young. And as I said, I don't know anything about Mrs. Walbert. The body was brought to Friedens from Mock Chunk, now Jim Thorpe, by the undertaker Alfred Kraus, who picked it up from the 1 o'clock train that came to Friedensville, as it was called. The body was taken to Krause's shop. He was an undertaker, a carpenter, as undertakers were back then, and it remained there till Friday afternoon, and the interment was made, the interment was made, but the concern was that there was so much commotion and curiosity about this body that when the interment happened, the grave itself was watched for 3 nights to keep the curious and eager crowd away from the body. And the reverend who performed the interment was Reverend J.B. Fox, who preached supposedly an eloquent sermon for the occasion. Very little was said to the living people present, and there were about 1,500 people who came, which is just unbelievable. It must have been everybody in Slatington and Friedens. So I don't know. They watched the grave for several nights, and then I guess they figured out it was okay to leave it. And the man left behind a mother whose name was Valentine Valtz, V-A-L-Z, and she lived in what was then called Franklin, but we know as Emerald. And the only other thing that the Slatington News said, and this is like, the least of things you could say about this person who murdered someone and was hung, was that he was of a lazy disposition, and he met his victim in the vicinity of his burial ground. So I guess it was all a fitting ending. And the tombstone says, William D., son of William and Lita Stengel, not Valentine. I don't know who Valentine was at that point. He was born October 2nd, 1859. He died March 26th, 1891. And that was the glorious end of Mr. Stengel. We've done, this is the 4th cemetery walk we've done. Maybe we don't know of any other murderer, but your cemetery is famous because it's got a murderer buried here. So good luck with that. Thank
Boy, I'm so happy to see such a large crowd here. You never know who's going to show up for these events, but anyway, I'm fortunate enough to talk about the Lentzes. One of them that I knew pretty well, and the other 2 that I just heard about. Anyway, we'll start with Moses Lentzes. He was born February 17th, 1823, the son of William and Magnolia. Moses' brothers were Aaron, Eli, Joel, and Jonathan, and one sister, Mrs. Kate Kuntz. Moses married Jenny Krause, daughter of Frederick and Kathleen Krause. Moses and Jenny had the following children: Paul F., Mrs. A. Kunkel, Glendon A., Mrs. Griffith Ain, Evans, and Amos. Moses and Jenny had 17 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. And also the name that will come up more frequently is he was the grandson of Louis C. Lentz. Moses was widely known and lived in Friedensville for over 50 years, and one of the oldest residents of Washington Township when he died at 75, October 2nd, 1897. His wife, Jenny, was 84 when she died May 13th, 1911. They were both very active members of this church that are buried in Friedens Cemetery. Moses' home and land is to the right of the church going up the hill and currently owned by Jamie Harway. One of the more interesting stories I have to share with you is sad, but it's also happy, is the Herbert Paul Lentz story. Born in Friedens, Pennsylvania, On January 15th, 1899, the oldest son of Alkin and Lizzie A. Lentz. Herbert grew up in a close-knit family who were active members of the Friedens Church. And this area is where he made his best friendships. When Herbert was a young man, his father moved to Allentown to be the manager of the Edmund Brothers Meat Market. Herbert was employed as a machinist at the Allentown Taylor Engineering Plant. At age 17, Herbert enlisted in the United States Navy on July 2nd, 1916, and was assigned to the battleship USS Arkansas. In February 1917, Herbert transferred to destroyer Jacob Jones as a fireman third class. This new class destroyer was on convoy duty off Queenstown, Ireland on December 6, 1917, when at 4:20 p.m. that afternoon a torpedo from German submarine U-53 hit the Jacob Jones and sank it within 7 minutes. Of the 112 men crew, only 44 survived. One of the crew members, Howard A. Moyer, recorded the account of this heroic death of Herbert Paul Lentz by giving him credit for saving at least 3 lives. Mr. Moyer stated that Mr. Lentz would not have Mr. Lentz would have survived if he would not have went for the force. Fireman First Class Howard A. Moyer is one of the lives that he saved. When the submarine was near the survivors, its guns trained on the on the crew, held up in a lifeboat. They captured 2 hostages, or 2 prisoners of war. A British destroyer cruiser Camelot was responding to a German submarine's SOS after it sunk the Jacob Jones. The Camelot arrived 10 a.m. the next day, and 6 of the 29 survivors died from exposure. They were taken to Queenstown, transferred to the USS Medville, the mothership of the American destroyers. Mr. Moyer testified that there were many brave men on the Jacob Jones, but Herbert Paul Lentz was the bravest of them all. Herbert Paul Lentz was the first Lehigh County hero who died in the Great War. His memorial service was held here at Friedens Church on February 10th, 1918. The service, conducted by J.O. Owens, was short and simple. It was the grief of this community was so deep, too deep for words. With a crowded church, there was hundreds of unable people attended outside, indicating the esteem in which Mr. Lentz had with the people of this area. Allentown American Legion Post 3, Port 9, was named after Herbert Paul Lentz. Herbert is also remembered on his parents' tombstone in Union Cemetery. Mr. Lentz is also remembered on a Missing at Sea plaque in the American Cemetery, a memorial located in Hesty, France. Okay, the one that I know the most and have the most fond memories about would be Dewey C. Lentz. Dewey C. Lentz was born August 4th, 1899, the son of Gilden A. Lentz and Maggie Lentz. He married a Lentz. Okay. Dewey had two brothers, Preston D. and Stanley F., and three sisters, Miss J.J. Schneck, Sina M., and Hattie M. Gilden was a well-known horseman with his son Preston, conducting sales and exchanges in the stable in Newhart. Gilden also worked in construction and served in the Washington Township supervisor. Gilden and Maggie were buried in the Friedens Cemetery. Dewey was best known as the owner and operator of a Lentz Garage in Newhart. He operated that garage from 1926 till he retired in 1972. Anyone living in this area knows Dewey Lentz's Hill. Did anybody ever go up Dewey Lentz's Hill? Dewey Lentz's Hill was great if it was open. But boy, don't try to go up when there's snow and ice on it, because the person that gets stuck in front of you is going to make you back down the hill. Dewey's first wife, Mabel Lentz, was only 28 years old when she died on April 10th, 1936. She was a beloved member of the Friedens Church, and as was custom back then, everyone who sent flowers to the funeral were listed in the article about her death. Then they took all those flowers out and they put it on the grave. Dewey was a well-respected local businessman whose second wife, Mildred Conrad Lentz. Dewey died March 19th, 1984, at the age of 85. He was survived by his wife, Mildred, and two daughters, Ellen and Constantine, 6 grandchildren, and, 6 grandchildren and three great-grandchildren. Dewey is laid rest in Friedens Cemetery also.
Okay, I'm going to talk about one of the most famous historians from Friedens, and that is Walter Thomas Handwork. Walter Thomas Handwork was born on October 23rd, 1886 in Washington Township. He was the youngest son of Casper and Alina M. Kern Handwork. His parents lived in the former village that was then known as Huffman's, which today is now known as Friedens. He was a descendant of many of the founding patriarchs in the greater northern Lehigh area, which included Johannes Handwork, Casper Peter, Hans Jörg Ruger Rex, Adam Schneck, Johannes Adam Baer, Nicholas Kern, and Johannes Hunsaker. So he had a pretty good ancestry there. When he was just 8 years old, his father Casper passed away at the young age of 53. With this loss, young Walter needed to assist in providing for his family. By 1900, at the age of 13, he worked in the local slate quarries. While working, he also was diligently studying to complete his public school education. In 1901, he passed the 8th grade examination and earned a diploma from the Washington and Heidelberg schools. In order to earn a diploma, the students needed to earn a 70% average or higher on a culminating examination. Walter Handwork earned a grade of 82 7/9, good for second highest in his class. There were only 10 students from Washington and Heidelberg townships that passed the exam that year. During the 1900s, Walter was employed at a variety of local businesses. In 1904, he accepted a position as a clerk with Josiah Cole in Slatington. Later, he was a secretary at the Slatington Rolling Mill. On February 13, 1906, he married Carrie Olivia Peter of Best Station. They had the following children: Beatrice S., who married Vincent Takacs of Palmer Township; Helen A., who married Warren Rohrbach of Slatington, David P., and Thomas P. The entire Handwork family were dedicated and faithful members of Friedens Church while they lived in the area. On November 5th, 1909, Walter Handwork became the second postmaster of the Huffman's Post Office. He held this role until the post office was disbanded in 1916, with postal service being rerouted to Slatington. While Walter worked for the Slatington Rolling Mill, he also owned and operated his own general store at the corner of Route 873 and Friedens Road, right down here. He owned that from 1910 to 1946. The store was first opened by B.W. Kern in 1884 and then was bought out by John Geiger, then Francis Huffman, before Handwork owned the business. Walter also repaired shoes at this location when there were no customers in the store. In 1916, he began work for the Slatington Iron and Steel Company. By 1920, Handwork became involved in a local community affairs and politics. It was in this year that he was the first elected township auditor, a position that he would hold for 20 years. He also eventually served as a member of the Washington Township Board of Supervisors as its secretary for 26 years. Finally, he was also the secretary of the Lehigh County Supervisors and Auditors Association for 20 years before retiring that post in 1960. During the 1930s, Walter was named president of the Handwork Family Reunion Committee. He was an integral member of this organization for the greater part of 3 decades, serving as a member of the executive committee in the 1940s and treasurer in the 1950s. One of Walter's greatest local accomplishments was being a founder and charter member of the Friedens Fire Company. The association was founded in 1936 and still benefits Washington Township today, over 85 years later. In his retirement, Walter authored 2 books. The first was titled Fligel Pater, The Humorous World of the Pennsylvania Dutch Country, and it was based off of stories that were told by Oswell C. Peter. A 1967 Allentown Morning Call article describes Peter as, quote, an eccentric storyteller in the little village of Friedens near Slatington, but was known far and wide as Fligel Pater, or Winged Peter. Some of Oswell's stories and anecdotes were gathered by Walter Handwork and published in this book. I highly recommend if you can get a hand on the copy. It was pretty funny when I read some of the stories. The second publication, which was titled Friedens 1840 to 1940, looked at the history of the first century of the village. Much of the information in the second book was relayed to him by Mary Ann Peter Huffman, who was a daughter of John and Catherine Haas Peter, who we heard about earlier, and they were the ones that owned the farm that encompassed the land of what is now Friedens. Walter Handwork died on January 22nd, 1983 at Sacred Heart Hospital in Allentown at the ripe old age of 96 years and 3 months.
Hi. My name is Susan J. Kern, and many of my descendants are buried here at Friedens, I'm sorry to say. I am very happy to be here with you today, and I'm going to talk a little about my descendants that came from Friedens. Too much up here. What does Friedens mean? Does anybody know? I did not know until today. It means peace. And I'm saying to you, peace be with all of you. My descendants were James R. Kern, and he lived in Slategdale. He was very quiet, but he was a proprietor of the J.P. Kern
class in Slategdale and in the church. He began working for the Consolidated Lehigh Slate Company, and he was only 18. 18, and this was a full-time job. The first quarry that he called was, does anybody know the name of the quarry up there? It's called Big Slate, and now it's owned by the Papes. Or Big Ben, yes. He also started a slate finishing company, and he also started something called Trout Creek. He and his family were active members in the church up there, and that is Slategdale, which is now has the United Methodist Church, which closed because it did not have enough members. James married Mary Hangwork, and later he became a person very well known in Slategdale. His home was right next to the church, if you knew that or not, and he organized the Slategdale Cemetery Association up there. James P. married Mary Hangwork, and they had many children. I think it was 15 children. That's a lot of children to take care of. There was also another family involved with this family, and they were the Ringers. They had 4 children. Henry later married Harry President, who lost 2 children, and their names, excuse me because my reading glasses aren't reading very closely. Their names were Dottie and Marriott Sloyer. And they had, do you remember the furniture store up there? It was long ago. It was Current's Furniture. It now is closed, like so many things up in Slategdale. There was somebody else that I was very close to, and her name was Aunt Blanche. She had no children, but she had me. And when I had too much going on in Main Street in Slatington, I used to walk up to Aunt Blanche because she would give me additional love. There were also some other children. Does anybody remember Vincent Kern? Vincent Kern and 2 of his brothers, and one was my dad, they had the cable company in Slatington. And Blanche worked there. But she didn't work. She just talked a lot. Geyer's hardware store was right across the street, and she would often talk to her. Is there anything else you would like to know? Because I am open for questions. Anything else? I don't want to bore you. I am a member of this Slatington Prehistoric Committee, and we are active. We are very, very active. So thank you for your attention, and have a great day.
Okay, I hear the congregation here likes long sermons, 45 minutes long, so sit back. No, I'll be relatively brief. I'm going to be talking about the descendants of Michael Newhart, 1742 to 1814. Now, this is just a typical example of one of the many families who ended up settling in Washington Township, attending the Friedens Church, and later being buried in the cemetery here. Obviously, we can't highlight every family. George Frederick, Michael, and George Newhart immigrated to America on the ship St. Andrew, sailing from the major port city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands and arriving in Philadelphia on September 26, 1737. During this time period in the 1700s, crossing the Atlantic would often take 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes longer depending on the weather conditions. By contrast, a modern ocean liner can make the same trip in 7 days. Just to give us some perspective of the time frame I'm speaking about, Nicholas Kern, the first settler to the area of Lower Slatington, arrived in Philadelphia on September 21st, 1732, on the ship Plaisance, which also departed from Rotterdam. In 1837, after securing 2 separate land warrants totaling 500 acres, or the equivalent of roughly 3/4 of a square mile, Kern settled in what later became Slatington. Ambrose Romeli came to America in 1749 on the ship Lydia. Like Kern, Romeli also secured land warrants totaling several hundred acres in what is now Upper Slatington and just inside what is now Washington Township, just south of Slatington. Both Kern and Romeli were from the Palatinate area of Germany. Michael Neuhardt, the second of 3 brothers, was born in Zweibrücken, Germany on February 9th, 1713, and died on March 10th, 1793. Zweibrücken, which in English means 2 bridges, is located in the Rhineland-Palatinate area of Germany. Michael secured a warrant on June 11th, 1738, a tract of 83 acres along the Lehigh River near what is now Laurie Station, North Whitehall Township. He later added to this so that in 1768 he owned 200 acres, 70 of which could be cultivated. He was naturalized on April 10th, 1759, and was a member of the Egypt Reformed Church, where he and his wife are buried. His wife Barbara was born on April 1st, 1716, and died September 12th, 1792. At the time of his death, he was the father of 15 children, which goes to show that Michael did not spend all of his time in the fields. Michael Neuhardt Jr., the oldest son of Michael, was born May 7th, 1742, and died in 1814. He was a weaver and farmer and owned 200 acres in North Whitehall Township. During colonial times, weavers worked with wool, flax, hemp, and sometimes silk. Michael served as a private in the Revolutionary War. He was a deacon of the Egypt Reformed Church, where his father had been an elder and a deacon. He and his wife had 12 children. Peter Neuhardt, son of Michael Jr., was born in 1778 and died in 1856. He married Maria Romeli, and they were buried in the Neff Cemetery. The following descendants are buried here on Friedens Cemetery. Johann Peter Neuhardt III, 1832 to 1899, son of Peter, and he married Harriet Reber. James Peter Neuhardt, 1871 to 1925, son of Johann Peter, married Matilda Alvina, not sure how that's pronounced. Moses P. Neuhardt, 1857 to 1905, another son of Johann Peter, married Harriet Binder. Henry Neuhardt, 1897 to 1968, son of James Peter, married Ava Snyder. Alan H. Neuhardt, 1919 to 1963, son of Henry, married Claire Silfies. David Neuhardt, 1939 to 2021, son of Alan H., married Arlene Fulweiler. Alan Neuhardt, 1944 to 2022, son of Alan H., married first Sandra K. Smith, and then second Judith Leiby Feinauer. I just want to end my presentation by speaking a little bit about land warrants that I alluded to earlier, since this was the primary method that this area of Washington Township was settled. Generally speaking, a land warrant is an application to purchase a certain amount of land in a particular locality from the state government. In Pennsylvania, prior to this time and towards the Philadelphia region and its suburbs, this meant William Penn and later his 3 sons. In 1681, William Penn received a royal deed, a New World colony, as payment for a debt of 16,000 pounds from King Charles II. He owed, Penn's father, Sir William Penn, who was a deceased admiral in the British Navy. If you've been following the news lately, you know, of course, that there is now a King Charles III of England. This charter made Penn the world's largest non-royal landowner at over 45,000 square miles. In 1682, the State Land Office was established by William Penn to record these deeds and land warrants. In 1685, 4 years after issuing his conditions or concessions document, William Penn sold over 700,000 acres to 600 purchasers in the southeastern portion of the colony, mostly to rich London Quakers. Penn distributed land in large plots to encourage low population density. That he thought would make for the perfect combination of city and country. Penn's outright and complete ownership of Pennsylvania eventually ended when the colonists forced Penn to agree that only the General Assembly could make laws. In 1752, Heidelberg Township, which at the time included the land comprising present-day Washington Township, was settled. It was not until 1847 that Washington Township was organized as its present state, when Heidelberg Township was divided into two regions. The western portion retained its name, and the eastern portion was named Dallas Township, as Jamie alluded to earlier. A year later, the name was changed to Washington Township on April 21st, 1848. The early settlers to this area in Washington Township came mostly from Germany and Switzerland. Between 1743 and 1792, settlers were granted land warrants that totaled a little over 3,000 acres, or nearly 4 3/4 square miles. Today, the township has an area covering 24 square miles, or 15,590 acres. Most of the following names that I'm going to be reading you'll recognize, as the descendants have been in the northern Lehigh area for generations. Gurman, Geiger, Hauser, Hoffman, Handwerk, Hoffey, Kern, Kuntz, Kunkel, Moyer, Maurer, Missimer, Neihart, Oswald, Peters, Reeder, Rockel, Rex, Romali, Rook, Ware, and Wasson. Thank you.